I'm good, thank you. How are you today?
I'm doing well. We're going to get started shortly. We're just making sure we've got all our ducks in a row over here.
Okay. You did a great presentation last week. I really enjoyed it, so I look
Oh,
forward to today.
thanks, Rita.
And I'm going to mute you for now, so that way we
Okay.
don't get any backlash here, or whatever you call it.
Feedback. Yeah, sounds great. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. We are going to go ahead and get started. So I just want to say thank you for everyone for tuning in for part two. Last week, we talked specifically about creating inclusive classrooms, and this week we're going to talk about some specific teaching frameworks and some strategies that you can use in your classroom. So just as a quick recap, last week we talked about inclusive classrooms as spaces where instructors and students work together to create and sustain an environment where everyone feels safe, supported, and encouraged in the learning process. So this week we're going to dive right into some applicable strategies for you to use. So the first thing that I want to do is just a quick overview. We're going to talk about incorporating diversity into your classroom pedagogy. So we'll talk about your teaching approach, having inclusive conversations, looking at some reciprocal feedback, and then we'll go into 4 specific teaching frameworks that you can use. So while we're looking at your teaching approach, a lot of times when we're thinking about the pedagogy that we use in the classroom, we're looking at how we interact with the material. But remember last week we talked about actually looking at maybe some of your specific biases or assumptions. And so when you're thinking about your approach to how you're going to teach material, you want to start by asking yourself some complex questions when you're planning your materials. So our complex questions are not yes or no questions, but they're more where more questions can come up. So do you know the demographics are of your audience, or what are the demographics of your class? How will students that identify differently than you experience the lecture? Could what you're talking about offend anyone? Is it a sensitive subject that could serve as a trigger? So what we're looking for in these kinds of questions is to come up with maybe 3 or 4 questions that you have. That I actually keep mine in a little journal or sometimes a note card, depending on what the topic is. And I'll ask myself those because it changes every semester, right? Like you may not have one class that reacts to the same material in the same way, even though it's the same course. And so when you're asking yourself those in the planning, you actually are planning for anything that could happen in the classroom. You're going to utilize examples that reflect the diversity of our society and your classroom. It's sometimes hard for me to understand what examples are going to be relevant to my students. So for example, on some campuses, all of my students are traditional college age. And the examples that I use, if I'm talking about MySpace, they have zero idea what that is. But for some of my older students who, if they were around when MySpace was, I guess, poppin' is what we would say now, they understand what that is. But for my younger students, I need to use Facebook or even Twitter or Instagram. And so making sure that all of our examples reflect the diversity in our society and in our classroom. So taking into consideration not just what our students know, but also what they have access to. There are some students that won't have any idea what different luxuries are. And when I say luxuries, it's not like I guess if let's say we're talking about going on vacations, I can't assume that all of my students know what Hilton Head is. Students that go on vacation and beach vacation with their families, or have timeshares or vacation properties or things like that, they may know what those are, but other students who don't have those opportunities, they don't know what those are. So I can't take one example and think that it will be understood by all of the students. So making sure that there's some diversity in the actual examples that we use in our classroom. In your teaching approach, providing feedback regularly is very important. One of the things that I recently read about is when you provide feedback regularly, you allow students to get to know you and what you want. And although it doesn't always seem like that is an aspect of diversity, consider them having 3, 4, 5 different professors, right? They can't, just like we aren't assuming on the student end that all of our students are the same, they can't assume that all of their professors are the same. And so when we allow them to interact with us regularly, what we're doing is we're actually serving as a role model for them to see diversity within the teaching staff. And so we have to make sure that we provide those opportunities so they can experience it from both sides. Additionally, we want to assess student work using multiple, flexible, and accessible methods. One of the things that I realized early on is that I can't always put all of my students' work online. So for example, if I'm teaching my Intro to Social class, I can have a Blackboard shell created, and I can put everything on there. I can put their tests on there, they could submit papers, etc. But there are a lot of my students who don't know how to navigate Blackboard. And if I start that way from the beginning, then it's not accessible to everybody. And so I've learned to be a bit more flexible in the way that I'm assessing their work and giving them feedback, making sure that there's multiple opportunities, not just for them to get to know how I grade and get to know the way that I expect them to turn things in, but also allowing them to have the opportunity to learn. So I've had someone come in my classes and talk about Blackboard, or talking about using online materials or citing different things, just to kind of expand their knowledge, even though it's not specifically in my content area. And then lastly, in terms of your teaching approach, expand your range of approaches and attempt something that's outside of your comfort zone. If you're not comfortable with using multimedia or YouTube clips or some sort of online questionnaire or survey, then it may be that you just need to practice a little bit and then incorporate it in there. I know I was at a conference and I was listening to Kalina and Caroline present, and they had a Kahoot survey that was part of the actual presentation. I had never utilized that inside my classroom, but now I can, and I practiced it, and I had some people at my house. I was like, all right, go to this website, do this. And I didn't do it the first time in the classroom, but I practiced. It was outside of my comfort zone, but my students loved it. For some reason, they loved that they could take out their phone and it was brand new. They were so engaged because they wanted to know the next question. And that was a way that I could actually bring everybody into the classroom, into actually producing materials for the lecture. So when we're talking about being authentic and including our students' voices, and making sure that what we're teaching is reflective of a large group, then what better way to have student voices in there than to just ask them in the middle of the lecture. So one of the things that actually prevents people from doing a lot of things is it steps outside of your comfort zone. And so what I want us to do is at each campus, or if you're online, go ahead and write it in the topics, but I want you to think about your top 2 eggshell topics. Now, what are eggshell topics, you ask? those are topics that I would consider that I sometimes don't even want to touch them because they're going to break, right? Or they're just so uncomfortable that you just don't want to go around them. And so what are those topics that come up in your classes that make you uncomfortable? And why are they so uncomfortable? It could be a specific content area topic, or it could be the utilizing of technology that you just don't like. You feel uncomfortable because it's going to mess up. And so what I want you to do is think about those top two and share it in the group.
Right, that's that one.
So these are some amazing topics. What I want you to do is take it a step further and answer the second question. Why are they uncomfortable for you? Or why are they uncomfortable for you to address in the classroom? What creates that feeling? All right, so we had some wonderful, interesting topics. So it seems though that overarching, one of the topics that people are very uncomfortable talking about are politics, religion. For those of you on the phone, someone added sex. And sometimes it's just because of the way that the students respond to it. Like even if it's not political, then the way the student responds to it is politically charged, and then it turns into a political conversation. We had technology. That's definitely difficult when we don't have the tech working in our specific buildings, and our assignment or our lesson or something was planned around that, right? And so I appreciate Julia's comment that sometimes you're afraid that the students won't be able to manage their emotions effectively, and may offend one another with comments. That's one of the biggest reasons why professors and educators don't want to get into sensitive areas, because you don't want to be in a situation where students offend each other, or you don't want to seem as if you are on one side or you're partial to another side. And so what I want to talk about next is keeping these things in mind, but I want to go into actually having inclusive conversations and some things that we can do prior to those conversations and during the conversations that'll actually help us when they come up. So the first thing is, in inclusive conversations, you want to make sure that you establish ground rules. If you have any topic that you think could potentially have I would say, a charged conversation, include these in your syllabus, right? Don't just think that students will know how to talk to each other. In setting your expectations, you can set your expectations on how they talk to each other.
Can you hear this?
I can hear you.
Can you hear what I'm listening?
I can hear you talking.
All right, I'm going to mute you so Jessica can continue.
You want to also facilitate productive discussions. One of the things that you want to do is either provide content, or even when you're asking the students their opinions on something, you want to provide the context of that specific situation. So if you're worried that a student is taking something political and it wasn't meant to be political, it's okay for you to redirect the conversation and say, that wasn't, I appreciate your input. I want you to know that's not exactly where I was going with that, but I think that that's a great idea for us to dive into later. You can resist, I would say, resist the desire to interrupt. Sometimes that's so difficult. And I think it's definitely a skill to address a student who talks and talks and talks and talks and talks and talks and talks. And you have to strategically jump in there when they take a breath, right? But this isn't talking about that kind of student, right? This is talking about when you're having a conversation and students may be disagreeing about something, or they may be expressing an opinion that's completely different than what you would actually agree with. Resist the desire to interrupt that student. It does two things. First, it allows that student to, one, feel like they're heard, but two, it allows you to consciously make an effort not to be partial in the conversation. And the way that you can combat that is to include everyone into the conversation. You can increase participation with alternative discussion measures. So when I was talking about Kahoot earlier, that's a way for students to engage in the conversation when you're asking questions without saying their actual name, right? Like, I think that one time on Kahoot, my name was Run for Tacos. Like, because I didn't know what we were doing. I just wanted everybody to know that I go running because I like to eat tacos. But nobody knew it was me. And so if I was feeling a certain type of way, or I wanted to answer the question truthfully, I could do that. There's in sociology, we call it the veil of the screen, right? Like, you have a complete veil where you can be authentic, but you don't have to fear penalty of what you're gonna say. Now, granted, on things like Kahoot, then you can actually predetermine what their answers are going to be, but you still give them a bit of choice, right? You can also use things like Twitter. One of the things that I've done in a class is I have created a Twitter account for students to comment on while we're actually doing something, or we're watching a video, or we are listening to a discussion. And on this Twitter account, they can, I'll make a post, and then they can ask questions, or they can make comments, and I can go back through all of them later. The interesting thing about that is they have to follow it or they have to share it. So I know who the students are, right? And then at that point, you actually have some sort of accountability so you don't have a whole bunch of crazy comments, which is good. I put in my syllabus that students have to understand, and we discussed that they can disagree on a concept, but they can agree to learn from each other, right? We don't always have to convince someone to think the way that we think, but we can challenge them to look at it in a different way. The way that I tell my students is, I'm not trying to convince you to think one way or another. What I want you to do is understand a specific concept or context of a conversation from I say like a 360 view. And you don't have to change your mind, but it makes your argument stronger, right? It makes your argument stronger if you say, I believe this because of this, this, this. I've looked at it this way and this way and this way, but I still believe this and this is why, right? Rather than saying like, because that's just what I think. One sounds significantly stronger than the other. And I know that I had my, that I said it a little bit different and my tone was different, but you understand the concept, right? When you can look at things from different ways, then you can actually learn and make your argument stronger. When I tell students they can make their argument stronger, they're like, absolutely, that's what I want to do. And then we move them from actually trying to convince people of stuff to understanding different concepts, and they actually learn from each other. When you're introducing conversations and you want it to be inclusive in the classroom, be brief. Be brief. You don't have to explain every single thing and every single aspect to a situation. You can allow your students to engage in the material, and rather than you tell them how to think or tell them what they should be thinking about something, that's when you engage them and you ask them questions and you get their feedback. And you have to actually listen to them. Not just hearing that they're talking, but actually listening and engaging and using your active listening techniques. Like, so what I hear you saying is making sure that your students feel heard is going to require you to listen. That's how you create an inclusive conversation, because what will start to happen is students will want to talk to you because they know you're listening, because they know you're reflecting on their feedback, you understand their opinion. Even if you don't agree or they don't agree with the text, they know that you heard what they were saying. When we talk about reciprocal feedback, what I want you to do is take 20 seconds and think about a time where someone told you something constructive. Think about a time when someone told you something constructive, whether it was at a job or on a paper you did in grad school, or you read some student evaluations of your work. Think about a time when someone told you something that was constructive. All right.
We're muted still.
We are.
Oh, there you go.
All right, so now that you have the opportunity to think about when someone gave you some constructive feedback, the reason that I said constructive feedback is because sometimes people just give feedback, right? Like you've had somebody say, do this or do that or do this or do that, and you're like, okay. And then they're like, that was bad. Well, great. How do I improve it for next time, right? And so what happens when you have reciprocal feedback, and I don't know what I did to the slide, but what happens, I think my graphic didn't just come in, and it's okay. So I'll just explain it. What happens when you have a reciprocal feedback is you actually create what looks kind of like, I imagine it as a wind tunnel, right? It keeps going circular and circular and circular. And what that looks like is it looks like you giving feedback to your students in your classroom, but they're actually able to give you feedback also. So one of the ways that I really utilize this is when I give summative assessment. So when I'm giving a test, if every single person in my class gets question 3 and 4 wrong, it might not be the students that don't understand that. It may be that I didn't explain something correctly. It may be that the example that I used wasn't relevant and they actually couldn't connect with it, so they didn't remember it, right? And so that allows not just for me to look at if they can get the question right, it allows me to look at how those questions are reflecting my teaching. And so the feedback then becomes reciprocal, right? And so I come back to that in a future class. Reciprocal feedback is also assessment. Absolutely. Working that in there. I love it. And so when we're looking at the way that we interact with students, it's not just our feedback on them, right? We want to hear what they have to say. That goes into that inclusive conversations. It goes into listening and giving them space. Because if we're telling them something, we're trying to make them get better, right? Whatever content we're trying to teach, it's to help them understand something better, to do something better, right? And so if they're telling us they don't understand, we have to listen to that. Or if they tell us that that doesn't make sense, then we have to listen to that. And so allowing us to be the experts, but also the learners of our students, creates an amazing environment in the classroom where everybody feels safe to express how they're interacting with the material. And that really goes a long way in terms of creating your inclusive classroom. So now we're going to go into a couple of frameworks, right? There are 4 specific frameworks when you talk about the way that you interact in the classroom and making sure that everyone feels like it's an inclusive environment. The first one is community building. When you think about community building, it's exactly what it says, right? You're building a little community in your classroom. And so what you're doing is you're going to provide interactions inside and outside of the classroom to actually connect the students to each other. You're not going to have generalizations. So I avoid generalizations at all costs. I remember I had a professor who used to say, millennials do this, and millennials do this, and millennials do this. And I was thinking, well, that he must not be talking about me because I don't do any of those things, right? And so he immediately, I felt so isolated from people who did do those things. And so you avoid generalizations, but you also allow time for all hands that are raised to be addressed. What that means is a lot of times we want to move on. We want to make sure our content gets addressed. We want to make sure that we reach all of our learning goals for every single class. But sometimes that means that we don't allow enough time for all hands to be raised, for all hands that are raised to be addressed. We need to make sure that this happens because sometimes in classrooms, and hopefully it's not yours, but sometimes in classrooms, a person or a section of the room gets addressed more than other sections of the room. Or you'll notice that one person raised their hands quicker, so that's where your eyes move all the time. Sometimes if you just wait a couple seconds, it may seem uncomfortable, but you allow for that maybe introverted person who wanted to think about their answer for a second to raise their hand, and you allow them to participate in the classroom. You acknowledge the effort of everyone that's actually raising their hand. I know when I was in school, I had a bit of anxiety. I wanted to always be right. Crazy thing, right? But I had a bit of anxiety when I was unsure about the answer. And so for me to raise my hand in the class, it was a big deal for me. And I was crushed when no one would call on me because I didn't do it that often, right? And if we move past it too much, we may miss the opportunity to acknowledge the effort of a student. Right or wrong answer but we miss that acknowledgement of their effort that could keep them engaged in the community, right? When you call on somebody, you also let the rest of the class know that what they have to say is important. And so you acknowledging them as the teacher and allowing them to have the space to say whatever answer they're going to give, it tells the rest of the class that their opinion is valuable. Additionally, in community building, you allow yourself to model how to separate behavior/performance from the individual student. One of the ways that I do this is after we have some sort of assessment, or we watch a video clip, and I ask students what they think about it. And I will just jot down on the board the top 3 things that it seems like people are saying. And so I'll say, it seems like majority of the class is drawing attention to these 3 things. And so it doesn't put any one person attached to those themes, right? It allows us to have the conversation about these 3 things in the classroom without singling one specific person out. Sometimes if there's something that we definitely need to get to, or I'm feeling like people aren't picking it up, or just one person, I'll add an individual theme in there and be like, I think that I heard this, right? But it gets that in there, and it releases the individual person from talking about that specific thing, but it allows the community to come together in conversation about a thematic issue that I brought up as the professor. It also, when you build community in your classrooms, it allows for each student to have the dignity to risk within your classroom. That goes into that safe space, right? Because when students are raising their hands and they're participating, they have to be able to risk the option of being wrong with dignity, right? You don't want to say, you're horrible, you're wrong. Like, I know that none of you would ever embarrass a student like that, but the way you address how students interact, it matters. If you are like, even if you just put your head down and you shake your head when somebody says something, that could hurt their confidence so bad they never ever participate again, right? Like, we don't know what's going on in our students' lives outside of our classroom, so we want to make sure that even inside the classroom, even when they're not 100%, I won't say 100% on task, but 100% in having the right answer, we want to make sure that we're acknowledging what they're doing and what they're bringing to the table. So sometimes if a student is so excited about having an answer and it's the wrong answer, I'll say, okay, I feel like that's an amazing answer, and we'll come back to that later because I have a question that goes with that. But I want to see if someone else can get this question, right? Like, what I did was I just put their answer on the back burner, and I didn't say, hey, that was a really bad answer. I still brought them into the community. I'm going to bring their answer into the community, and we can still discuss it, but we'll do it later, right? When I find a question that goes to that answer. But I actually most of the time do that when students who don't normally participate, they decide to participate, and I want to make sure that I can bring them back into the conversation later. A great way to start doing this is in the beginning of your classes. You do something to serve as an icebreaker, right? So you make the students feel like they belong in the classroom. That's not attached to the content. It's not attached to a grade, but you're making them feel like they belong in this space. And so what I want you to do now, and this is a lot of talking independently, so we will actually share out by sites or online if you are there, but I want to give you 2 minutes, and what I want you to do is brainstorm icebreakers that you do in the beginning of your classes. So identify and tell the group one activity that you've utilized to introduce students to one another. Is that something that you do every class? And then identify and share one activity that you've utilized to get to know your students and for them to get to know each other. And these are mostly things that I would say, I do them the first class, maybe the second class, but some some of my other colleagues that I know do one at the beginning of every class throughout the entire semester. So it could be at any point in the semester. You've got about 3 minutes and then we'll come back and share out. So we are having so much fun over here talking about all of the icebreakers that we do. Kenneth, I think that that's hilarious. Welcome to Introduction to Sociology in Spanish. As you talk in English, I feel like a lot of I feel like students would freak out.
Oh, you're still muted.
Oh, I am?
I thought it says you're still muted over here.
Oh.
Try again.
Um,
There you go.
Okay, I'm going to repeat because I think that I was on mute. We're having some amazing conversations over here. So what I wanted to do really quick is share out from the different sites if you had any good activities that you do that you weren't able to type in. So let's see. Can you unmute a site?
Yeah, who do you want me to unmute? I can unmute Voice.
Does anyone from Voice want to share out?
It's just Zach here, and
Hey, Zach.
full disclosure, I was going through applications for a committee I'm on.
It's okay, Zach. No worries.
Would you do an icebreaker icebreaker in that committee.
I will now.
I love it. It's okay. Who's next?
South Campus. We could try South.
South? Do we have any icebreakers from South?
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, we had John presented a good one. John Hartner presented a good one. He has a word of the day calendar. So it's got 365 vocabulary words on it, or new words to build somebody's vocabulary.
Mm-hmm.
And so what he'll do is he'll pass that around and have the students find their birth word and then think about it for a few minutes and then get into groups and have discussions about how that word might be related to them, represent them, how it's relative to them. And so he says not only does it expand vocabulary to some extent, maybe, but it also breaks the ice and gets students talking to each other.
Yeah, that's a great one.
Yeah, we thought so too.
Everyone's going to go buy those calendars now.
It's going to be a run on it in the store.
Everybody will be there carrying.
They'll be cheaper now that it's the middle of the year.
That's hilarious.
At North, Rebecca was saying that she uses a bingo game where the students have to, like, she'll have a list of questions and they have to go around, you know, like something like, do you like coffee? Drink coffee. And so then you have to go find someone, and you can't use the same person more than 3 times to answer the question. I do one where I tell them to find out, they're interviewing each other, kind of put them in pairs and they have to interview each other and find out, I always say their name and then 4 or 5 interesting things about them that we probably would not think they do. And then they each introduce each other, so that way we get to know each other a little bit better. That's it from North.
Thank you. We were talking over here. We were talking about the idea of asking one question and then going around the room, and some different ideas that we could incorporate to alleviate that. And so I was sharing that one of the things I do is I'll give students a note card and I'll ask them what their favorite song is. And so I always have students who will say, I don't have a favorite song. And I'm like, all right, what'd you listen to more than 5 times in the last week? So they write it down and then I have them assign a genre to it. So is it a rock song? Is it a rap song? Is it country, R&B, whatever? And then I have them organize in the class by genre. And so then they actually can talk about the songs that they were listening to. And so they connect over music. And then I tell them to line up in alphabetical order so they learn everyone's names. It's a quick way to just create some sort of community. And then they know something about other people, right? So if you know that you like classic rock and there's only 3 other people in the class that like it, you may bring or hear a song the next week or something that you're like, oh, have you ever heard this, right? And so you make that connection. So you're actually building the community. At the same time, you're helping them interact with one another.
So Jessica, on something on that venue, just recent, I don't know if any of you get Reader's Digest, but somehow they keep coming to my house. I guess I must be paying for them. I don't know. I don't see it on my credit card, so I don't know. But I keep getting them. But they have like little, like asking questions. And so one of them was, what's your go-to song? And when you're down. So I had my students submit that to me. You know, of course, I am, you know, at least 3 generations older than mine. So obviously a lot of songs are songs I never listened to. So I listened to them and they were just so tickled when I came back and, you know, I wrote back what I thought about each of their songs. And, you know, I said, I don't know how this would be your go-to song when you're feeling down. It didn't sound that way to me. But, you know, and they just loved it. I mean, did you listen to my song too? And I said, yeah, I was, you know, I actually watched the video a little bit saw a little more than I wanted to, or, you know, but they were just like, oh, so tickled that I'd done that, you know, and they still talk about it. So it's always kind of fun to put yourself in their shoes and get out of your comfort zone too. So,
yeah, and you actually allowed them to teach you something, right?
yes.
Like you took yourself out of the expert seat and you allowed them to teach you what's, I guess, songs that would be your go-to song. And just in case you wanted to know mine, it's High Hopes, Panic at the Disco, if you ever want to look that up.
Okay, I'll have to look that one up.
But the cool thing about this, right, is as you're building community, you go into the next framework. It naturally happens that students then start to learn and intentionally interact with each other. Before I moved, is there anybody else that wanted to share that didn't get to share? No?
The Spanish one online still cracking me up.
Oh yeah, to say that, who was that? Was that Kenneth?
Kenneth, yeah.
Oh yeah, Kenneth posted that he says that it's going to be whatever class it is in Spanish. And then I'm sure the students get so frazzled. They're like, I didn't sign up for the Spanish one. Of course, he said that wouldn't work in a Spanish class, but I'm sure it's a great conversation starter. So the next framework is looking at the student-to-student interactions. And I know that the first P in promotes should not be capitalized. I did that on an accident. That's for all my writing people out there. I acknowledge that I did that. But the collaboration promotes learning and inclusion, right? And so when we do things like we ask people to get together, like with my example, get together by genre, or they're looking at their word of the day, then what you're doing is you're not allowing anybody to be isolated. If you give everyone the same material, like everyone has a word, there's no reason, and they could even Google, like they could go on dictionary.com or Google their word if they don't know what it means, right? So they can actually, they all have the same information. So it allows them to be included in the conversation. So from the beginning of the class, you're not only creating a community, but you're including every single person in that community. You want to explain the value of collaboration. One of the things that I do is I try to help my students understand that one brain doesn't operate like the other brain, doesn't operate like another brain. And so if you make friends in the class, it's like being friends with people who are going to think a completely different way and understand something a completely different way. And so when you have conversations with them, then you can understand the material so much better because you have four people's interpretation of it. I've even had classes that have set up a Google Doc, and all of them go in and they'll type their notes actually while we're doing class, or they type their questions in there. And so everybody can see all the questions, right? Because I know everybody has heard no question is a bad question, or if one person has a question, more than likely 3 other people have the same question. And it actually allows the students to interact at an amazing level because I don't go into the Google Docs and answer their questions. They are actually helping each other. I do put some caveats when I find out they're doing it, and I try to tell them that if there is a specific reference or page number, something that they could go to or point a person to, then that's great too with their explanation. But it allows them to not just regurgitate what I'm telling them, but it allows them to there to be some peer-led education. So you are fostering student-to-student interactions, which is sometimes more comfortable for people to be engaged with because it's not the pressure of the professor who's actually coming down on you. So you create a space for students to be the experts in your classroom. Use peer evaluation to establish individual and group accountability. One of the ways that's great to do that is if you are, let's say you're in a writing class and you have a 5-page paper at the end of the semester. Let's say 8 weeks into the semester, you want them to bring a detailed outline. They think they're gonna come in and maybe turn it into you, but you say, okay, everyone get out your group outline, get out your outline, and what I want you to do is we'll all get in a circle and we'll pass it to the left. The person on the left is going to read your paper. That creates some individual accountability, right? Because it's not just, no, I didn't hand this in. If I don't bring my paper, then I can't participate. because I'm leaving someone else out of the, you know, the critiquing process. And so that's individual accountability for me, right? It also creates group accountability, because when I'm giving someone my feedback, not only are they part of my community, but now they're depending on my feedback to help their paper be better. And so we move from our students being just in a community together to they're actually invested in the other student doing well, right? Their work is contributing to the other student doing well. And so we actually move into some positive accountability and some educational support from the students on a peer level. Randomly assign groups as to not isolate individuals or support cliques. A lot of, when you talk about inclusive classrooms, a lot of the material is around making sure students aren't isolated and that you're including everybody. I also make sure that I don't support the cliques in my classroom, right? And because I could put all of my loners together in a group, right? But it'd be so much better if I could spread out all the groups that are in the class. I've had classes where I've had 7 baseball players all together, and they just sit together because they know that after that they're going to practice, or they're all tired together, but they have this community already. And so what I do is I spread them out and make sure that I'm integrating all of the groups, and then it just happens that now some of my students are going to baseball games because they have a baseball player in their group, and now they know all these other people. And so aside from not isolating people, we're also making sure that if our students already have cliques, that we expose them to something else. And then asking, yes.
You know, when you're saying randomly assigned groups, I do that a lot in my class because a lot of my students, you know, they all come from the same high school, so they know each other. And a way that I randomly assign them is that I take a deck of playing cards and I pull out, you know, like the aces, the kings, the queens, whatever. And then they have to pick one of the cards, and then okay, all the kings are here, all the queens. So that way takes it away from me. You know, they can't say, oh, you put us in groups, or, you know, so it works well. They always kind of, and like you said, they eventually start to kind of click, and I start to see people who I probably never would have seen together now together, which is nice.
Yeah, that is really nice. And you, like, I always think it's, I want to say adorable, but I know that's not the appropriate word. But I love it when I see the community starting to form outside of the classroom, right? Like you're walking, and then you see the students walking from one class to another. Or I'll overhear them. I teach an intercession course, and so we're there all day. And so I'll overhear them saying, all right, after this, we're going to go to Taco Bell. Do you want to go? Do you want to go? Do you want to go? Right. And so it's not one student doing that. So they actually are taking that community outside the classroom, which is always amazing. Let's see. And someone from Boyce said they have students grouped together for each major essay and perform peer review. Groups are different for every paper. That's amazing, right? Because the other thing that when you're doing peer review and the students are getting the interactions with one another, sometimes a student is making a mistake that their peer reviewer has also made. And it makes you not feel like you're the only person that's making this mistake, because you see it on someone else's paper, right? And so you kind of commiserate with that person, but you can also encourage them in a way that'll encourage yourself too. So I think that's amazing. I'm so glad that so many people are doing it. It's very beneficial, and it builds the inclusivity of your classroom in ways that we can't even imagine. The third framework is looking at instructor to student interactions. I want to make sure that we have some time for questions. So when you're looking at the type of interaction that you have between the instructor and the student, make sure that you're intentional about the message that you're sending. So What I mean by that is make sure that you pay attention to things like your body language. Sometimes, because I teach a class that goes from 6 to 9, sometimes I'm tired. And I have to be very intentional about sitting up in my chair or making sure that my sound of my voice isn't like this, because that's how I feel on the inside, right? So I want to make sure that I'm very intentional about the message that I'm sending to my students. Incorporate discussion and participation expectations into and throughout the course, right? You want to make sure that your students know what you expect of them. You want to make sure that you are setting high expectations, because they'll achieve what their goal in this class is to impress you, right? They want your grade, they want your A. And so when you set an expectation that's very high and help them attain it, they're going to be so much more likely to get there because they think that you believe in them, right? Which goes into communicate your belief that your students can be successful. I'm always telling my students, you can do this. You can do this. If I'm explaining something in a way that doesn't make sense, make sure you raise your hand or send me an email, because there are some other ways that we can explain it, but I need to hear some feedback from you, right? Remember that reciprocal feedback that we were talking about? Making sure that as you're communicating that your students can be successful, you're understanding from them how they need you to communicate so they can be successful. You want to teach from a neutral perspective or acknowledge your bias. What we don't want to do is go into any kind of conversation, especially anything that when we were asking ourselves those questions at the beginning, could it be a trigger for someone? We don't want to go into those conversations thinking that we're teaching from a neutral perspective or not acknowledging the bias that we have. So I will share, my sister has a daughter who has special needs. And I remember when she was about 2, she was going through a lot of issues with getting the right people to come and do in-home therapy. And so when I was teaching my section on the sociology of medicine and looking at medical systems in the United States, I acknowledged my bias to my class that there was something that was going on in my family, and I was so frustrated at how hard it was to get someone that was consistent and reliable to continue doing this therapy for my niece. Like, it was something that was emotional for me, and I knew that that would come across in what I was teaching. I knew that it would come across in the content and that I wasn't coming from a neutral perspective. So I acknowledged that bias from the beginning. I shared it with my students. We talked about it as a small case study. And so I think that they, one, saw me more as a person who actually had biases. Oh my goodness. Nobody has those when they're teaching, right? But I did, and I acknowledged it, and it allowed my students to see me and have interactions with me as a person outside of their professor. Completely professional, right? But actually understanding that I'm a person and I have viewpoints. And so making sure that you strategically utilize your content to navigate difficult viewpoints, disagreements, and or discussions inside the course. You can use your bias as a way to start a discussion. You can also navigate different viewpoints by utilizing your content. So what that means is, do you have strategies that you can insert into your course when things are getting difficult? Sometimes I do think, pair, shares. And if the conversation is getting heated, I'll say, okay, I have a question and I want to make sure that everybody gets a chance to answer it. So we're going to do a think, pair, share. That immediately stops because it forces everyone to go into the think phase, right? And so instead of now being in a heated discussion, they're now thinking. They're still going to get to pair with someone and go back into possibly that conversation, or with the question, I can maneuver the conversation or digress a little bit if I wanted to. But I'm utilizing the content and my classroom strategies to navigate difficult viewpoints or disagreements or discussions. So you want to make sure in all your instructor to student interactions that you have strategies that you can use in the classroom when things get difficult. The last framework, and I know that this is a lot of information, and I'm sorry I'm trying to squeeze it all in, but the last framework is content and process. And so that's really looking at the interaction that you have with the content and how students are processing it. So you can motivate students through a connection with your course content. So ask them to give you examples of concepts. One of the things that I talk about, I teach sociology class, and we were teaching the section on race, and we were talking about racially profiling and what that looks like. And so I asked students to write down on a note card what it looks like to be racially profiled. Do they know anybody that's been racially profiled? Have they ever been racially profiled themselves? And those were the examples that I incorporated into my lecture. They all came from students in the classroom, so they were all real, and some of them didn't give me examples, but they actually had like a definition that they thought was racially profiling. And so I had like 4 different definitions on the screen, and it allowed us to kind of talk through and process and take pieces of one and pieces of the other. But everyone contributed through to the content through the process of understanding it. Ask students about their prior knowledge of the subject, right? If you're teaching an anatomy course, ask students have they taken any biology before, or if they have had, is this something that they talked about in a different class? But understanding if they have prior knowledge on it helps you get a gauge on where the students are, right? You know, if you're teaching a geometry course, that if your students don't know shapes, that maybe you should start at a basic level. I'm sure all of our students know shapes, and I was being very facetious about that, but you get my point, right? You want to ask students about their knowledge so they can tell you what they know. You can emphasize the larger impact or influence of a subject, topic, or content area. So when you're talking about things, make sure, so I'll get back to that in 1 second. So when you're talking about a specific content area, make sure you help students understand the broader impact of it or influence of it. One of the things that I always used to love is when I love math, by the way. I'm a sociology professor and a sociologist by training, but I love math. And so a lot of students will say, I'm never going to use this in my entire life. Why do I have to take calculus, or why do I have to take geometry, right? And so, but the way that my mind works, I always tell my students, you want to drive, don't you? And they're like, yeah. I'm like, well, how are you going to calculate how you need to turn this corner to not hit that other car? You need math. Like, you need it. And they're like, well, since you said I needed to drive, I'm going to do it, right? And so you help them understand how that subject or topic or content area can be inserted into the broader context of their life, right? And so it has more impact. Ryan wrote on the comments that some of our students definitely do not know shapes. And the cool thing about that is that you have to talk to them to understand what they know and they don't know, right? We do want to avoid generalizations. And even though we do have prerequisites for some things, some students, they may not have come to class that day. They may have been out on medical leave or something, or they didn't read that chapter. And so sometimes it's really important that we actually ask them about their prior knowledge and for them to give you examples, because if they give you an example of something that they think they know about, but the example is wrong, then you know that you know exactly where you have to start. So absolutely, it's important to know what our students know, how they conceptualize it, and you can look at the holes or the gaps in their learning. And the last thing in terms of content and process is to use formative feedback often. I was sharing over here that it's important to have multiple strategies to get formative feedback, because I was doing minute papers every single class. Not only were my students getting tired of it, but I had 45 students in my class. So that was 45 papers that I had to read at the end of every class, right? And so sometimes understanding different strategies to get that formative feedback, just to make sure that your students are engaging in the content and they're actually processing the information, is very, very important. But it also allows another way for students to access information and to interact with the information. And that creates a more inclusive classroom. So thank you, everyone, for tuning in for these 2 weeks. But I do want to ask, are there any questions?
And feel free to unmute yourself
Yeah.
if you want to talk, because I had everybody muted. So
go ahead and unmute yourself if you want to talk, or there's a question from your center.
it's interesting. Sometimes in my class, I have the experts. Like I have students that already work in the field, already took the class, but that deadline is passed. They know everything, and it puts the other students like, they're like, well, I'll never know as much as that person. Once they acknowledge that, oh no, but they're so-and-so worked here, then it's like they use them as an asset more than feeling inferior.
Right.
You know,
Absolutely.
but until you acknowledge that. It's interesting because I see that all the time.
Yeah. I've had students in my class one time at the Homewood Russian Center. I taught racial and ethnic minorities, and I had a student who, he was retired from construction. He was, I don't want to say his name, but I think that he was almost like 67 years old, and he had lived in the East End his entire life. He lived in Homewood his entire life. So as we were talking about like the progression of the community, he was so knowledgeable. Like he knew where stores used to be, on what corners, and when they closed. And so
he was like, he
was the resident expert of Homewood in my class.
Kind of interesting that you gravitate to that person.
Yeah.
So you're getting thank yous
across
the chat. So maybe no one has any questions. You've answered them all.
Yeah. So if you have any other questions, please feel free to shoot me an email if you want to have lunch and just talk about some of these things more. I've learned that the more you talk about it, the more some of these things, they're not eggshell topics anymore, right? Like you talk about it a little bit more, you get a little bit more comfortable, and we're going for progress and not perfection. So thank you everyone for being willing, and I hope everyone has a great rest of the week and great rest of the semester.